I've had a lot of crazy ideas when it comes to creating a diorama, but Das Boot might be my wildest one yet. Hi, I'm Jacob Richards and welcome back for another tutorial. Every diorama starts out with a model kit. For this kit, or this diorama, I started with Meng's U-Boat Type 7. The kit was easy to build and it's a great little project for both new and experienced modelers. After the model was built in sub-assemblies, I primed it in Stynylrez black primer and let it cure for several hours. With the primer established, it was time to add my first coat of Vallejo Color Deep Sea Blue. I built the color up using several light layers, being careful not to obscure the decal at such a small scale, but also to make sure I left some black in the recesses to create that nice contrast across the bottom of the model. After the base coat was established, I then went about highlighting the different panels with Vallejo Color Dark Sea Blue and a little bit of light gray. Again, this effect is powerful, but it's best to do it in thin layers. Otherwise, if you flood the model, you lose that precious detail, which is detrimental at such a small scale. With the lower hull complete, it was time for me to move on to the upper hull. I took out some sky gray and white by Vallejo Color and added several light layers to the upper hull of the model, getting both the conning tower and the hull to make sure everything was nice and even across the board. After I had the upper hull complete, it was time for me to move on to the wooden deck. At first I wasn't quite sure how to approach this part, but I used a variety of methods including dry brushing and then adding light streaks of the different wood colors to create the wood planking effect. Dry brushing actually gets a bad rap across the hobby community because it's actually viewed as a beginner technique. However, if you do it correctly, it's a great effect on your model to use at any given time. In this case, I used the dry brushing technique to preserve the darker recesses to create the nice shadow and contrast I wanted with the details on the deck. After the dry brushing was complete, I took thin paint and created the illusion of wooden planks across the deck. With the wood effect done, it was time for me to bring back the details I had covered up with the wood colors. For this, I took Vallejo's Neutral Grey and started going about and highlighting all of the metal parts on top of the deck. I took my time with this particular part because the details are so fine and I was using thinner paint to preserve the detail. This kit is full of small details, so I had to take some very good care not to get the red paint on the conning tower here. I kept the paint very thin and took a very light touch to make sure I didn't get that anywhere else but the light preserver. After I had the details in place, it's time for me to varnish the model and let it sit for a day. I typically will varnish the model and put it in a box, that way I don't get any cat hair, which is abundant in my household, anywhere on the model. Now it's time for my favorite part of this entire process, weathering. For this task, I went about using Wilder's Deep Shadow Wash and start hitting the panel lines like there's no tomorrow. The secret to any good panel lining job is to keep your medium thin. Whether you use oils or enamels, if you have the right consistency, the medium will flow into the details using capillary action, making your life that much easier. After about an hour or so, I came back with a mostly dry brush, wet it with a tiny hint of thinner to start cleaning up my panel lines. The trick is to let the wash dry long enough so it's not going to spread around as you start cleaning it, but also not let it sit too long where you can't take it off at all. With the cleanup complete, it was time for me to bring back the raised details on the lower hull. I took a fine 3-0 brush, or is it 3/0, and went about very carefully using the side of my brush to hit the raised details as carefully as I could. As you can see here, I made a mistake, but mistakes like that are easy to correct with very tiny amount of isopropyl alcohol. Now it was time for the chipping process. I took a sponge and loaded it up with Vallejo Monocolor's Off-White, and then removed the majority of the paint from the sponge. From there, went very carefully, just tapping the model ever so slightly and building up the chips. After the first pass of chipping was complete, I went about adding some rust. I took a fine brush and went over the model, applying the rust streaking effect where I thought most of it would accumulate. After it was applied, I then took a mostly dry brush and started blending the effect across the hull. The best way to make this effect look realistic is to take your time and build up layers of streaks, whether it be grime or whether it be rust. Streaking effects and rust effects in real life don't just happen once and then they're one and done. It actually occurs over time as oxidation takes place. By building the effect up in layers, the end result is both natural and pleasing to the eye. After the rust filter was complete, I took some scale color rust colors and created darker chips within the white chips I created earlier. Creating chips with a small brush like this does take a long time, but the effect is incredibly rewarding. The trick is to use the small brush and a slight tapping motion to create the nice sporadic chips all over the model. It makes it look very natural looking. After the darker chips are in place, I took Wilder's Ochre Rust speckling effect and added another very light rust layer over my previous work. I took my time blending this effect because it is very crucial to make the layer both visible but transparent to show your work underneath it. Plus, having very defined streaks and dots of rust around there makes it too distracting for the eye when you're looking at the overall piece. Alright, the model's done. At this point I took some beauty shots before I decided to possibly ruin it when putting it in resin inside a giant German drinking boot. If you're ever curious about how I take these photos, be sure to check out the MichToy Soldier blog about my photography article that was posted a while back. And this is the part where my nerves kicked in, because I had this idea in my head for a long time. I spent weeks working on this model, and it was time for me to add a resin into this entire process. So to anchor my U-boat to the bottom of the boot, I took some green stuff UV resin and anchored it into the spot that I thought would be the best presentation point for this entire piece. The UV resin dried very quick with the UV light, and I was able to actually handle it within a matter of minutes after I applied it. At this point, it was necessary for me to create a little jig to hold my entire piece in place while the resin cured. For this project, I used my go-to resin, Magic Water. It's easy to use and has a very low curing temperature. To get the beer color, I added a hint of ink, and I was good to go. After the pour was complete, I let it sit for several days and I didn't dare to breathe on it. With the resin cured, it was time for me to bring the beer a little more to life. I made some waves using Mod Podge and a flat chisel brush. Mod Podge is very easy to use and has a good working time, and it dries clear. The trick to making good waves with Mod Podge is again to work in layers. The more layers you add, the more turbulent the water will look. Aside from adding waves with Mod Podge, I wanted to make the beer look a little more dynamic, so I got some cotton, strung it out, and added it to the Mod Podge. As it dried, I took a pair of tweezers and a wood stick and added it to the wet Mod Podge, and then slowly but surely kind of just tease it out with my brush to build up the effect and to add a little more of the Mod Podge to the strands of cotton. As you add more to the cotton, it looks more and more like foamy water, or in this case, foamy beer. And just like that, this entire project was done. This one had special meaning to me because it was the first project I completed after recovering from viral meningitis. It was a challenge to do, but these are the type of things that push my skills to become a better and better scale modeler. I've got a lot to learn, but stuff like this makes it very fun to come into my hobby room each day and try something new. As always, thanks for coming along on this fun little journey. It's always great to present my work, and a big thanks to MichToy Soldier for allowing me to present my stuff. Stay safe in this time of COVID-19, wash your hands, and just keep hobbying. Have a great one, guys. Talk to you later.